Thank you for joining us for a FACT, Family and Children's Trust Fund event sponsored by the Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Advisory Group of the FACT Board. We're going to talk about child-on-child sexual assault cases today and hear from a panel of folks who have worked these cases and have some experience. Just as a little background for those of you who may not know about the Child Abuse Neglect Group under FACT, the group was established in 2012 with membership from local and state stakeholders. And it actually came out of a governmental reorganization under Governor McDonnell, I think, where the previous board, the Governor's Advisory Board on Child Abuse and Neglect, was folded into the FACT with the Family and Children's Trust Fund. And our work on CAN, what's most relevant for today, I guess, is to advise the FACT board regarding prevention and treatment, review policies, practices, and compliance of state and local CPS services, make recommendations for change when necessary, and advocate for effective child protection. The CAN group, that's what Child Abuse and Neglect stands for, also serves as a citizen review panel for purposes of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. Okay. So I don't know whether Janine is on the call. My name is Ginny Powell, and I am a member of the FACT board and a co-chair with Janine Harper. And I don't know whether Janine's on the call, but hello, Janine, I hope you'll be here. So I wanted to just start with a little bit of housekeeping. We ask that you mute the guests on the call, mute their microphones and listen in. And if and when you have questions, if you would type them into the chat, and Nicole is going to be our chat organizer. She'll be looking at the chat, and we'll stop around 10 after 12 and see what questions have come up in the chat, and we'll ask our panelists to go ahead and respond to those questions. Okay, so thanks for that. That's the housekeeping. Wanted to just tell you a little bit about what we hope to do today and where this second summit has come from. We recognize on the CAN committee, we've been talking about this issue for a couple of years now, that the issue of child-on-child sexual abuse is a pretty complex issue that ranges from problematic sexual behavior among children all the way to sexual assault and harassment. We estimate that there are about 1/3 of all cases of sexual assault are child-on-child between children, and that 20 to 25% of cases seen by our children's, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the word, CACs, Children's
Child Advocacy Center.
What's that?
Child Advocacy Center.
Thank you. I forgot the A. Yeah, I was only with Alliance. Child Advocacy Centers. About 20 to 25% of their cases that they see in Virginia are child-on-child. Okay. At the same time, we don't think we have a full picture of what these cases are like, what the dynamics are, what's going on in those cases. We don't have a strong sense of the larger landscape. We do have some information, but we don't know a lot. Seems like folks maybe don't want to talk about it in some ways. There's a lack of resources for children and families, not completely clear to us what the therapy is and what the response should be. So we want to change that on the CAN committee and on the FACT board. We think that there is strong evidence that if children and their families get treatment and are helped, that they can kind of move through this and stop doing harm to others, that we're not really talking about a predator sort of situation. We also know that there's a real lack of clarity about which agency is responsible for responding to these cases if it is not a CPS case where the child who has offended or has the sexually problematic behavior is actually in a caregiver role vis-a-vis the other child. So we on the CAN committee took a look at the whole spectrum of cases, from children with problematic sex behavior to cases of sexual abuse and harassment, as I said. And then we hosted a panel in April of this year on a host of topics and really kind of talked about the range of cases and responses. Nicole has made that available to you when she sent out the invitation for this meeting, and it's also on the FACT website if you want to see what happened in that summit, what kind of information was communicated. Today we want to focus on problematic sexual behavior involving children outside the CPS system. Okay, so that's kind of the cases that we're going to look at. Again, I said we're gonna talk for about an hour and 5 minutes. In a minute, we'll just have the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll go into our conversation, and then we'll wrap up around 12:10, and Nicole will read us some questions from the chat from you that you want to address to the panel. If you have a question for a particular panel member, please let Nicole know that so she can direct that question appropriately. Okay, so if you would please, I'd like to have each of the panelists introduce herself to the group and tell us a little bit about your experience around these cases. And let's go ahead and just start with you, Judge White.
I'm Ellen White. I am a retired juvenile and domestic relations district court judge. I still serve on the recall list, so I'm still sitting as a retired judge and serve as a judicial consultant. My experience in these cases, of course, would be when the young person is charged with committing a sexual offense against another child, and the case comes before me in court. So these are the kinds of cases I would have heard as a judge and still could potentially hear as a judge.
Okay, thank you. And Judge White is also a member of the Child Abuse and Neglect Advisory Committee. So
yes,
thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, how about Nancy?
Hi, I'm Nancy Oglesby, and I spent a little over 20 years in the courtroom as a prosecutor. Most of those years spent focused on special victims type cases and juvenile court. And I now wear two hats. I am a trainer and consultant for a company, Justice 3D, and we do that nationally. And then I also serve as the resource prosecutor for Commonwealth Attorney Services Council on the same issues, special victims type cases, domestic violence, sexual assault, and juvenile issues. And my experience would be in the sense of obviously at times prosecution, but also dealing with screening these cases, and if not choosing to proceed with charges, trying to navigate the system of what proper intervention looks like.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Brianna. Good morning.
Hi, my name is Brianna Valentino. I have worked in the field of interpersonal violence for the last 13 years. The last 8 have been as the forensic interviewer at the Greater Richmond Scan Child Advocacy Center. So within that role, my job is to conduct interviews of the alleged victims whenever a youth or child is suspected of having acted out on another child.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And Adrienne Gardner.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Gardner. I'm a lieutenant with the Richmond Police Department. I've been with Richmond just about 17 years. Currently, I don't work in this role anymore, but just previous to my assignment I'm in now, I spent 3 years as a sergeant in charge of our youth and family crimes team. So I supervised a team of detectives that investigated child physical and sexual assault. So any CPS referrals that were received by our agency were fielded by me and my co-sergeant. We'd handle assignments from there, and really working with the MDT, so Brianna and SCAN, and with our local Commonwealth attorneys to determine whether it's prosecution route or kind of how we're going to handle cases like this.
Okay, thank you. So you can see a wealth of knowledge, experience, and insight to help us today. So let's start with the issue of language. You saw me tripping all over myself at the beginning when I was, and so tell us what the appropriate use of language or the importance of language when we discuss these cases. What do you think is the most helpful or accurate description? And what are the consequences of using a term like problematic sexual behavior versus a perpetrator, abuser, or a pedophile? Any insight into that? And it's kind of free flowing, so who'd ever like to go first?
So I'll jump in, and I will say that the term pedophile is something that is not going to be present in almost any child-on-child case unless you're dealing with someone very close to the age of 18. I've seen numerous psychosexual evaluations in cases and worked very closely with Dr. Evan Nelson over the years, who's an expert on both adult and juvenile offenders. And he would say that that's an inappropriate term when we're dealing with juveniles. Obviously, if there is a charge placed, the legal terminology kicks in. And so we're dealing with suspect, defendant, things of that nature. I think when we're looking at it from a reporting point of view, that's most commonly what we hear in the criminal justice world. I think we all can shift our language if needed, but we default to our terminology that the criminal justice dictates for all offenders more often than not.
Yeah,
So can,
I would just agree with that, in that if I make a police report, I have to identify the people that are involved in there, and I only have a certain few categories to list them as: a victim, a witness, an offender, a complainant. So, you know, we kind of have to put that label on it from the beginning, whether it comes in through a CPS referral, where they might call them an alleged abuser or perpetrator, or when I make an actual incident report. But then it kind of is on the backside of working with my detectives of, you know, kind of fleshing out the details of the case, that, you know, this offending child may also be a victim. But we kind of can't get to that point until we're further down the road in the investigation. So we have to put a label on it from the start, but it's more about understanding the bigger perspective of, you know, what the problem behavior is and where we can go as we get further in depth with it.
In the court context, we don't really refer to, we don't use any of those terms. We would refer to a young person who's charged with a crime. Of course, we call them a juvenile, and we would call them, if they are found to have committed an act, a delinquent. But we wouldn't distinguish. I mean, that would be no matter what the young person was charged with. If they are found to commit a delinquent act, we don't call them generally a defendant in the juvenile court. And of course, a victim would be called a victim.
Brianna?
Well, and I think in terms of the language, I think we're all have these constraints from the systems that we work in, but really changing that language to the problematic sexual behavior gets to the behavior and gets to really the purpose for juveniles is identifying that behavior for the purpose of helping them receive appropriate treatment. So, and we know that appropriate treatment is going to decrease their symptoms and then their further action. So I think it really then highlights that what we're focused in on is the behavior, not that there is a judgment or moral placement based on this child or youth.
So when you use this vocabulary, Brianna, and you're working with Lieutenant Gardner or Judge White or with the prosecutors, do you all use your own language?
Sometimes it feels like that, I would think too. And then also where, you know, where Lieutenant Gardner and I worked very closely is we're still in the investigative process, right? So we are trying to figure out, did this thing happen or did this thing not happen? And so automatically then labeling a youth or a child as having problematic sexual behavior where we are involved may not even be the most appropriate thing because we're just trying to figure out what if something has occurred at this point.
But your disciplines really kind of craft your vocabulary. That's
Yes.
clear from what you're doing. Okay. Could you just, I want to follow up just with you, Nancy, for just a minute. Why isn't pedophile appropriate just for purposes of?
Because there are certain criteria that have to be present to make someone a pedophile. And I'm going to try to get this right because Dr. Nelson has taught me over the years. You can't identify those behaviors. First of all, there's not a lot of good testing for juveniles to determine psychosexual deviancy. Also, the behaviors, again, you said it early on, the behaviors when we're seeing this in juvenile on juvenile most often are not going to be the same as an adult perpetrator perpetrating on a child. And so pedophile is a diagnosis of behavior that is not seen to apply to juveniles.
Okay, all right. Okay, can you move, well, moving on to the next question now, can you explain to us what you see as the dynamics in these cases? Are there typical cases that you can describe that would help us to understand what's going on in these cases? Is there a profile?
Yeah, on the front end, at our center, where we learn about these sorts of actions can be in one of two ways. One, the child has come to us because there's a different presenting incident where maybe an adult has sexually abused them, or they've experienced physical abuse, or they've witnessed violence. And because within the scope of the interview, we're really concerned about the child as a whole, and we're asking about other things that may have happened, the child may then indicate that they have also had this experience. Versus a case that comes to us because the presenting issue is that they may have been the victim of another child or youth engaging in this behavior with them. So we see them presenting two different ways. And then getting to the crux of, what potentially underlies this behavior. Sometimes we're able to kind of tease that out, and sometimes we're left with maybe a lack of understanding. But sometimes what we see is curiosity, and curiosity that can be compounded if these kids or youth live in homes where there's a dynamic of power control, right? So I'm curious. Now I'm going to use my power in this relationship to figure out what this is. Sometimes we also see exposure to material. So that could be within the home with other adults or older children in the home, or it could also be just technology, right? Technology is in every small child's hand at this point. If they don't know what something is, they can type something in. They don't even have to spell it correctly in order for things to pop up. And then they become exposed, and then they become curious, and they start to engage in these behaviors that they're seeing. And then sometimes we do see that kids have experienced sexual abuse, and now they are sexually reactive, and they're continuing those behaviors that were perpetrated on them onto other kids for a variety of different reasons. So that's kind of where we see on our intervention where these cases are coming.
Do you have a sense, Brianna, of can you describe the age differences between the two children? What their relationship is to each other? Do you have a sense of that?
So typically within the children's advocacy movement, when we're talking about children, it's going to be 0 to 12, and then youth are going to be in the 13 to 17 range. And so sometimes when we're talking about what may be a problematic sexual behavior, age does come into account, right? So is there a significant age difference between the child who's acting out and the child who's the victim child? Are there dynamics of coerciveness, right? I'll give you $1 if you do this and you don't tell anybody. That's very different than two kids who are engaged in mutual curiosity, where if one just wanders off, then this activity stops, right? Is it preoccupying their attention, and is there anything forceful around it?
Anyone else?
I would imagine that I see similar to what Lieutenant Gardner sees, which is just about everything. I would say most commonly what I saw was the older teenager with either a victim who is also an older teenager or at least post-pubescent. So we're dealing with a sexual exploration or coercion or force, but it's in that older teenager range. But we definitely received reports and investigations of younger children with younger children. And that's, of course, even more complicated when you think about criminal charges. Do we even have that as an option? And again, not necessarily that would be the choice we would make, but the younger the child, the more you have to consider, are we even dealing with a child that is in the purview of the criminal arena at all? So I would say my experience anecdotally is mostly with the teenager age group.
Yeah,
And how
kind of
about-
to piggyback off that, like with our consideration, we get reports of, ages that are quite varied, obviously, 17 on down. But we kind of have I guess like a dividing line for us. When I was doing these cases, our kind of age limit on prosecution was that we really wouldn't go below 11. So anything older than 11 for an offender involved would maybe have the potential to go into the criminal courts. And so we could kind of go a certain direction with that. But then everything younger, again, the CA I worked with, Kelly Burnett, was way more well-versed in this than me even, but just kind of the dynamics of it, the reasons behind the behaviors and the ability to be served other places and better than just to route them through the criminal justice system. That was kind of her hard line, was like right around 11. But yeah, so younger than that was more of the exploration, whether it be between siblings or cousins. We've had basically a kindergarten student who touched almost every other student in their classroom in somewhat inappropriate sexual type ways that came in. And then, it turns into there's many other children that have kind of been doing the same thing in the household. We would get a number of referrals like that when they're in that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old range. And then it's kind of falls into that same window of like the police are involved in something that probably isn't really a police matter, but we still get the referral and we're working from there to try to, figure out where did this begin with. Like Brianna said, is it exploration? Is it exposure? Technology? There's so many different ways, but we see a fair share of that younger age, but most of what makes it to the courts obviously is that 11 to 17.
And jumping in with what Lieutenant Gardner said, it's that those cases where it is those under 11, under 12 kids, that's really hard because that law enforcement is the only avenue for access to services sometimes, or people don't know who to contact. And there are not a lot of services. It's a really challenging position, especially if those two kids are in the same family, of how do you keep both kids safe? How do you support both kids? And then also on the caregiver, the parent side, how do you come to terms with this may have happened that one of my kids did this to the other? And so balancing all that. And those are just really the trickiest cases. And there's just not a lot of resources out there. And to Lieutenant Gardner's point, like, who is the most appropriate? What is the most appropriate agency to be at the forefront of handling those cases? Certainly the CAC is well equipped to conduct interviews and also provide treatment. But it's just a matter of how to identify them in order to get them engaged in those types of services.
And that's where the detective is often the one that makes the contact with the family, and just especially with everything that happened in 2020 and just the overall distrust of the police that we have in communities. Like, we're here to help you get to services, but also, like, people are just very fearful of the police. And so if there is someone else that'd be the better face to kind of route these families to services and resources and other things, we'd love to have that as an option. It's great if CPS is involved in these cases, because they definitely are received differently than us, which can be positive or negative depending on the family's experience. But there is a certain stigma with law enforcement being the ones kind of leading the way to try to route these families to try to get resolved to their issues.
Yeah, and I think from the law enforcement perspective too, we're trying to be really careful where the labels attach and where the paper trail starts. And that can happen unintentionally as soon as you're accessing services through law enforcement or ultimately prosecutors weighing in on decisions. And so that also, I think, is something to factor in who we route families to. We are, again, like we said, limited in our choices of language, and we have records. And so we can unfortunately brand a child something not intending to pretty quickly.
Judge White, is there anything for this question or?
No, I mean, I've seen children in court from 12 to 17 in these cases. I agree with what Brianna said in terms of the curiosity issue, the exposure issue, and prior abuse. So I agree basically with what's been said.
Okay.
And obviously, by the time they get to us, the case in the juvenile court, if they are under 14, and they're not charged with and well, if they're over 14, if they're charged with a felony, then of course the case is not confidential, is not a closed case. If they are 14, if they're under 14, any crime would be a closed case. If they're over 14 and the offense is alleged is a felony, then it is no longer a closed case in the juvenile court. So the issue that Nancy raised can become an issue.
Mhm. Okay. I think we'll return to these issues in just a minute. Can you help us to explain or tell us a little bit about the dynamics? I think we've talked about a little bit power control versus exploration, but can you explain or describe other kinds of triggers or dynamics that you think affect this problematic sexual behavior or contribute to this behavior?
Almost all of the juveniles that I saw in court had been prior victims.
Okay.
I'll say that
Mhm.
of sexual abuse. Not all, but almost most of them.
That certainly does bring up an interesting thing when those cases are going through prosecution, because sometimes what we have found is that sometimes those kids have never disclosed, and then they're actually disclosing when they're being interviewed as a suspect, right? And so we also want to make sure that we're attending to their victimology. And so figuring out when is the best time and place to gather that information from them so that they can also receive justice for what has happened to them, so we can explore that. And so teasing out and working collaboratively with both law enforcement and the Commonwealth Attorney's Office so that when they are brought to our center, so that we can take a statement from them, that no matter, if they're talking about what has happened with them and then they're linking it to the things that they may have done, that the CAC remains a safe place for them. And so whatever they say within that forensic interview then is not going to come back within the prosecution of what they may have done. So we're engaging in a lot of conversations to make sure that this remains a safe place for that kid as well to gather information about what they may have experienced too.
And is the law, the prosecution, the criminal justice process flexible enough to do that?
We can get really creative, but yes. And I will just say that I worked on more than one case where a child had, I default to the word offended. And again, that's me tripping over my words, but a child had acted on another child. There was a strong suspicion that child was also a victim. And I'm, either a charge is being placed because we need to access services and we're trying to get a guardian ad litem and we're trying to switch it over to a CHINS petition, or there's a defense attorney involved because it is an older child and there's some serious allegations that are appropriate for at least charging. And so then I'm going to the defense attorney and saying, I really want to do a screen out interview with your client. I'll agree up front that anything disclosed I will not use against. We're doing that in a written agreement. So all of that can happen. It takes trust with the defense attorney and the prosecutor's office, and that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It is, again, tricky as well because you also want to not agree to not pursue something that may come out that needs to be pursued. So flexibility is there, but it's a minefield.
Right. And it tends to be a little bit less complicated if those kids are on the 10 years old, 11 years old, right? Because then there the decision is there a possibility that this kid may be prosecuted? More than likely, in my experience, that answer is going to be no. We're really interested in what has happened so we can get them treatment. And so then we feel comfortable moving forward. And in those child on child cases, what we're trying to do is interview the alleged victim, but then also interview the child who may have acted out so we can gain from them an understanding of if this behavior does track back to an adult or to an other older child or to technology or wherever this behavior came from. So in those younger children, it is an easier decision or process. And then the older ones, like Nancy said, my experience has been just a lot of teamwork and discussions about how do we want to handle this in the best interest of this child. And we have had kids then who come to our center. And I remember one particular one, there are cameras in our interview room, right? Because we're recording everything we do. Investigators need to be able to watch. And he had a really poignant question. He said, oh, before I could explain the cameras, he said, oh, are the cameras there in case I do something, in case I like hurt you or do something bad? And I was like, no, like that's not why they're here. Those cameras are actually making sure that I am doing my job well. Right. And so because he had been so used to being looked at as a bad kid, as somebody had done something wrong, that's what he automatically assumed. And it really made an impact. Like, no, this is my responsibility. I need to do the best job by you. And so does the team.
Yeah. So just any comment on the parents and the family and the way they impact the dynamics when you have a sibling group?
Well, I would say some of the cases that that we get in Richmond, especially with the younger ones, we actually try to make referrals back to CPS for lack of supervision, because oftentimes it's just kids watching other kids and just kind of left to their own devices. At times we have families that have a real instability with housing, so they may be just lots of people under one roof, and some of the chaotic environment that comes with that. It's not across the board, but we definitely see that, and I can think of some real specific case examples with some younger kids where they just end up with so many under one roof, not enough rooms. And then if the parents do become aware on their own of some issues, they have difficulty even separating them within the house, or they don't have the strong support system to stay somewhere else or have someone else kind of assist with caring for the kids. And so I've definitely met some families that have tried to deal with it on their own, but just with those other struggles involved, they just really didn't have a lot of options and places just to even physically locate their kids.
Right. And I'd imagine this varies a great deal from community to community. Yeah.
Yes. And also there could be, definitely the different cultural, responses to it as well. You throw that on top of that. And yes, it's definitely, and obviously every case is different, but there are some patterns we see along those lines.
These cases aren't resolved quickly either. As Nancy mentioned, the process it's being explored by the attorneys. And often we'll place the person who's charged under certain conditions. And I think it can become difficult for families as the situation goes on for longer periods of time to maintain, your treatment for the child that offended it as to the other child, treatment for the child if that other child's in the home, where placement, all of those issues on a long-term basis can become problematic.
Jenny, I think you made a good point too at the very beginning of just sexual behavior in children is just not talked about, right? So it's even helping parents understand that this is something that has happened. And just even thinking about their children as having engaged in sexual acts and understanding that we're not looking at it as adult sexual behavior, but really these are behaviors that children have engaged in that have become problematic. And so then to Lieutenant Gardner's point, how do you structure your household? How do you provide supervision? A lot of the parents that we work with are just completely overwhelmed. They're protective, but they don't know how, and they don't have the capacity. Sometimes when we have these sibling groups where all of these kids are engaged in this behavior, what's happened sometimes for the younger ones is that it becomes normalized, right? This is what brothers and sisters do together. And so they don't quite understand the implications of everything that's happened. And sometimes that sexual activity feels good because our bodies are sexual beings, right? And so they then may seek out then those behaviors from their siblings, even if the parents are trying to keep everybody separate, because this is just what they know, right? It's not their fault. It's just what's happened. And so then trying to provide support for all of the kids is really, really challenging for parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else about dynamics, triggers? All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about interventions. What is it from your experience, what is it that children and their families need? Both children, their families need, and what sort of intervention strategies have you found effective?
So I'm going to go back to Dr. Nelson's mantra that when we deal with children who have concerning behavior sexually, that the recidivism is so much less than the adult rates when there is appropriate intervention. And he describes that as, counseling and therapy. The recognition of the child being, recognizing that this behavior is wrong, and then support in how to reframe their actions, their behaviors, and like Brianna said, even their desires, if it is something that they enjoyed. And so we know that the research bears out that when that happens, we don't see kids reoffend sexually. But that is the key, is that appropriate treatment, which then if we're dealing with the children from the criminal justice perspective, finding that and getting that is a long process, going through several different funding sources, and not always a successful process. So that's kind of the perspective I've seen.
Mhm. So do we have it? No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Do we have a good sense of the counseling and therapy modalities that work? And are these available in our communities in Virginia? You talked about funding, but what about just availability of services?
I would imagine, like anything else, that's going to vary from locality to locality.
Yeah.
We, in our area, and I was in the Lynchburg and surrounding counties area, we had community-based sex offender treatment through our community services board, and in some cases worked very effectively. It's very long-term too. The treatment period is a lot of times a year to 18 months. So it's pretty extensive and can be, and as I long-term. But I don't know if that exists. I don't know about other communities, what's available. And it generally, if a young person is found to have committed an offense against another, we would order, and I think Nancy mentioned earlier, a psychosexual evaluation. That'd be the first step, is that would be ordered by the court. And there is one funding stream I know for that. And then based on what the recommendations from that evaluation were, treatment would be ordered accordingly, generally.
Yeah, and we had some juveniles that were young that we did not want to convict, but needed inpatient treatment. And being in Henrico, in the Metro Richmond area, Henrico County has a lot of resources, we were still having to send those kids to the Tidewater area. I think there was a Northern Virginia, and again, I've been gone for a few years, but there was nothing locally if there was an inpatient component needed. And so that, again, when you layer that on to parents and siblings and all of that, it was very limited and very complicated.
And what happens if the children are siblings and one child has to leave the house? Is there that kind of scenario? What kind of services are available for those families? Are they on their own?
A real lack of services for those families. The benefit of having the CAC involvement is that we have child and family advocates who then can connect with the caregivers and provide them support and connect, if it's younger children, not children who are involved in the juvenile justice system, but younger children. There's evidence-based treatment out there through various versions of cognitive behavioral therapies. So ones that have been developed specifically for problematic sexual behavior. It's just managing to find a therapist who has the training, who doesn't have a wait list, who has the capacity to see these kids. But it's extremely challenging. And so really the CAC advocate oftentimes in those cases is going to be the only system connection that that family has long term with providing support.
And there's not enough CAC staff, right, to do this for the number of cases. We don't have a child advocacy center in all communities.
No.
Exactly. Every county does not have a child advocacy center. So I think getting the word out and helping communities with their own CACs, and then also having access to funding to appropriately have mental health staff on board, and then those resources to train mental health staff across the state as well.
Yeah. Is this cognitive behavioral therapy that you're talking about, is that a thing in training and preparing mental health professionals? Are they tracks in graduate school and their internships so that people are really getting trained to do that work? Do you know?
I'm not specifically familiar, but through my work with our CAC has the trauma focused treatment program, which is run by Lisa Wright. And so in talking with her, it seems like it's not part of undergraduate or graduate training. It's additional training that one needs to seek out. And then there's there's so many different subsets of it now. And there may be other evidence-based treatment that I'm just not aware of as the interviewer that therapists can access. But oftentimes it comes down to who are the therapists who specialize in this, and then do they have access to the training, access to funding for the training?
Anybody else? So, Nicole, I'm seeing a lot of activity in the chat. Is there something we should stop and think about here before we move on?
Yeah. So we got some good comments, just reiterating the need to establish trust before children start really making disclosures in these cases. That's a really critical component. So Betty Wade asked a great question about CHINs, and if you guys could go back maybe and talk a little bit about the use of CHINs petitions and how they're helpful, and are they used frequently, or is that a tool that could be used more often? Kind of how does that fit in this world and the scope of this problem?
Well, most frequently with the young children that come before the court, quite often they're found not to be competent to stand trial. They're not of an age where they should be before can be tried criminally. And when that happens, there is a provision on the code for the filing of a CHINs petition. And so that's generally where we would see CHINs petitions filed with the younger children. And yes, it's certainly a way to access services. So from that perspective, it can be helpful, yes. But I think then you still get back to the issues if there are enough services available, that kind of thing. The other thing that we have found, I mentioned the having a psychosexual evaluation. And I don't know if things have changed now, but we were only able to access those in the delinquency realm. We couldn't access that for other types of cases. And I don't know, maybe Nancy can speak more to that, but that was sometimes an issue if you wanted to have that kind of evaluation, getting to it without a charge. And of course, you can't get to the charge if the child's not competent to stand trial.
Yeah, and that was my experience as well, that there was limitations for the funding if it wasn't in the delinquency world. And we would sometimes in situations, if it was appropriate age for charge, even go to the defense attorney before proceeding to guilt or innocence and say, if you have the funding available in your child's family or however to get this done beforehand,
Right.
I'll factor what it says into how we handle this case. Again, trying to be very cautious, moving a child farther and farther along the process criminally. But it is something, again, that the funding, my experience is the same with the judge, that it's tagged to the delinquency portion of a situation.
So just a follow up to that, from Betty Wayne, the is CSA funding through the FAT process, is that used for these cases, or is that something that potentially could be used more? I know that there are referral requirements for children to get into that process, but are y'all kind of familiar? Do you see any opportunity for how that could be maximized?
Well, that I've seen that used in the cases, if they have been delinquency cases or CHINS cases, CSA funds being used to assist the family. One thing I guess I didn't mention earlier too, I think one, I will say, benefit of the juvenile justice system, even if the case follows a delinquency track, is that we do have an ability to defer findings. And we can defer them all of the way to the end of, as I say, the treatment can be extensive. We can defer them for lengthy periods of time so that you can end the case without making a delinquency finding ultimately, which I think is helpful, particularly in these types of cases.
I will piggyback on that one of the challenges as a prosecutor, though, even if the goal is to carry it as a deferment to dismiss, is that if the child misbehaves in another capacity, they spray paint something on the wall or they shoplift something, you're caught in a conundrum because the part of the deferral was good behavior. And so now we're trying to figure out, okay, do we pull the trigger? We've told them if they misbehave that this could be a conviction, but now the misbehavior has nothing to do with the sexual behavior. And so again, it's one of those things that as we push a child farther and farther along the path, we get more and more challenges that have to be navigated.
So with regard to the kind of the lack of practitioners and services available, like specialized clinical services available for these cases, I attended a workshop last week on this topic, and there was some discussion around kind of the majority of these cases don't need inpatient treatment, right? I mean, the majority of these cases, like most sorts of behavioral issues, like at the bottom of the pyramid where most of the cases sit, those cases really can be addressed with treatment that is not inpatient or in any kind of facility-based treatment. But we know that there aren't enough practitioners that are trained on this issue specifically. So Jennifer submitted a question related to kind of any thoughts that you all might have about increasing training for providers around the state for these types of cases. Does anyone have any ideas or thoughts about that? And
I wonder, oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, no, I was just gonna, because this is not a huge group, I was gonna actually invite Janine Harper to jump into this because she's executive director of Greater Richmond SCAN and knows a ton about this stuff. So, Janine, any ideas or thoughts you have?
Yeah. Hey, Brianna, what were you going to say? My great colleague who's sitting in the office next door to me on Gray Street. Were you going to say something about it? And I'm happy to say something about it as well. But
I think in my conversations with colleagues who've been through graduate school and additional training, I just think that there's a real lack of education provided in undergraduate and graduate programs about child abuse in general. Even if we think about the medical field and the amount of times that pediatricians are spent doing child abuse rotations. So I think that there's a real lack of that. And so then it makes sense to me that then the education around how do we treat these sort of sexual behavior problems is lacking because there's not even that base understanding. I think that there's more coming to the front about trauma and the impact of trauma, but specifically related to child abuse and child sexual abuse. It just doesn't seem like there is a lot there. And I wonder if that's also a good starting point to then rope into the treatment as well.
yeah, I would agree with all of that, Brianna, and that as we said and you said, that in graduate programs across the country and certainly in Virginia, there has been an increasing emphasis on trauma and practitioners understanding that impact. However, there hasn't been, just like there a number of kinds of issues that are more specialized and specific, you're generally not going to get that specialized training in a graduate school program. People tend to get out into the field, begin to figure out what might I want to specialize in within the broader context of behavioral health, and then will either seek that training or be able to avail themselves of that training in the, whatever practice context they're in. So, but to your other point, Nicole, I know the child advocacy centers, certainly across Virginia, and then nationally through the National Children's Alliance, which is the accrediting body of child advocacy centers across the country, they have increasingly provided training in terms of learning cohorts, learning collaboratives for CACs. We've participated in some of them for treatment modalities related to children with these behaviors. So I think, like everyone said, that I think we know what to do in many of these cases, but it really does come down to capacity in terms of people having the training. And the training isn't just about training, it's also always about ongoing supervision. As I think everyone has said, these are particularly complex clinical issues in addition to investigative and prosecution cases. So it's about training, but it's also ongoing supervision for these clinicians, how they can work collaboratively with these systems, because many times if you're practicing in an outpatient setting, you don't have time or billing capacity to be doing what CACs do, which, to Brianna's point, is we talk with other people all the time in systems. So I think at the end of the day, I think most practitioners with the appropriate training and desire to work with this population, it definitely is there, but I think it really is about increasing capacity for sure.
Is there anything else for right now, Nicole? Can we move on? Thank you, Janine.
Well, so we do have another comment from somebody, but I think maybe we should, who I'd like to kind of follow up with, but I'd like to be able to get through our primary list of questions and then maybe circle back around.
Okay, all right. So we want to talk a little bit about the role of technology in these cases, and how existing laws related to it help or hurt the handling of the cases.
So there's been in the last, I think, 4 years, I think 3 of those 4 years, there has been legislation tried to go through to deal with sexting with juveniles, and nothing has been successfully passed. I think there's a realization that these cases fit under child pornography laws, whether it be distribution, production, but that is not what the spirit of those laws were written for. And there's a lot of problems, obviously, with charging a person who is sexting with a felony child production, child distribution of pornography. But yet there's that need to want to intervene. And sometimes it's situations where, pictures been spread to 100 people at a high school. And, again, we're talking about complex situations. And I hope we will see what other states have done, which is craft something that gives prosecutors an option either for a deferment or some sort of a probationary education, other than the prosecutor being left with a charge that, in my opinion, is not intended for where we're dealing now with the technology with juveniles.
How common is it, Nancy, that technology plays a role?
Very common.
Very common.
It's very common in the younger kids where they're being exposed to things. I mean, I've had a case where young kids asked Alexa what a certain body part was, and Alexa pulled up body parts, and then they started doing the things based on what they saw, thanks to Alexa. So, or you have kids who are older Nancy was talking about the sexting or even sextortion, where then the messaging at schools is if you send a nude, then you are the one who's going to be in trouble, when really there's this other dynamic of the forcefulness, the coerciveness behind the sending of the nude picture. But then those victims then are afraid to come forward because what they've heard is the messaging is if you have sent a nude, you're going to be the one in trouble and you can get charged. So there's also the language to adolescents and younger kids as well, about the distinction and the dynamics as well.
Right. And so what would the law, what kind of a law would we need to accomplish moving away from the pornography approach? What is it that we need, that laws that are child protective?
Well, every option that I have seen has a problem in some capacity, because you deal with, and I'm going to focus on the older children first. When we have 18-year-olds in our high school, and then you deal with a situation with a 17-year-old sending her 18-year-old boyfriend a photograph, and he forwards it to two of his friends. Now you have an adult, and so you want to treat people equitable. You don't have an adult option, so that gets challenging. So I've seen some legislation try to loop in the older population, but then of course the older you get, the more we are wanting to pursue it in a different realm. Then there comes the situation of, okay, do you automatically treat it as a misdemeanor that has a deferral option? And then if they reoffend, is it a conviction, or do you have another bite at the apple? And that's where the legislations that have been proposed that I have seen come through get hung up, is there's a great discussion over how much we want to control the punishment in the legislation versus giving the court discretion based on the situations, and what do we do when we have reoffending, and at what point does a felony trigger? And that seems to be where all of the things get kind of lost in the mix.
And you're completely out of the service. You're not even talking about services anymore.
Um,
No,
some,
we're talking
some,
about maybe.
yeah, some of the proposed legislation specifically says that there is a deferral option to go through a education component, and then other legislations leave that up to the court based on, I guess, what the resources would be in the jurisdiction. It really has been varied what we see, and when we look nationwide, it's varied as well. Some have a component of a treatment, not really a treatment, but more of an education, in the sense that I think they're acknowledging the sending of pictures is not necessarily the acting out of behavior. And that puts kids in a whole nother category if both are present. So it's very varied across the country and in what I've seen proposed in Virginia.
Bullying, sexual harassment, those kinds of categories.
Right, and that's a challenge, because is it a picture that was taken voluntarily, shared voluntarily, and shared with one person, or are we dealing with, like I said, the situation where it's been broadcast across the entire high school, or like Brianna said, it's a situation where it is a sextortion situation from the very beginning, and that has a different component to it. So that's the challenging of lumping them all together as sexting. We can be dealing with very different behaviors and motivations as well.
Can you just explain sexhortation?
It's where someone in some way says, if it can be one of two things. It can be, if you don't send me a nude picture of you, I will do X, because I have either information about you, or I have something that would make you feel like you needed to send me that photograph, or you've sent me that photograph, and unless you do X, Y, Z, give me more photographs or do more things, I'm going to share that photograph with, numerous people. Or if you don't pay me, I'm going to share the photograph. It's that extortion piece that has to do with photographs of a sexual nature.
And so if you're in a public high school in Virginia, are you learning about this? And is somebody teaching you about this and talking to you about this as part of what is it called, family health or relationship training, whatever that's called? Are people talking about it with kids?
So I've done training for educators on this. I don't know how that's getting translated across different school systems.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And how in your opinion is the victim of this, how are they doing? We have a criminal justice response. Do we have services for that person or some kind of a response?
Well, here's where it gets complicated again, especially with the older teens. If I take a photograph of myself, that's child pornography production. So the victim actually could fit under a criminal statute as well. And so sometimes you get parents in the mix saying, well, if you're going to charge my son for sharing this photograph with his friend, then you also need to charge the girl who sent the photograph to him because she produced and distributed as well, even though it's her own body. And so it gets messy, the classification from the criminal justice position of are we dealing with victim? Are we dealing with suspect? Are we really dealing with people that need to be in the criminal justice system at all? But we get a lot of, if one person is charged and is put into the criminal justice system, we often get a lot of pressure from other people to charge everyone. And that then takes, that victim status away from that person.
Right, right.
So Jenny, before we hop off of this, I wanted to kind of share some of the comments. So Kristen is on the call, and she works for the state Sexual and Domestic Violence Alliance, and she shared that some of the sexual and domestic violence programs have outreach programs that are working like in the school systems and also with different youth programs that do education around some of these issues. And then the family life education in Virginia is not, this is just an overall comment, it's not a requirement for school systems to implement. So it varies from school system to school system. And they also are not required to implement all of the components of that. So that is certainly an issue that some folks think that there's an opportunity for improvement there around some of these issues as well.
Anything else? Thank you. Okay. So we'd like to have each of you, we're gonna ask you to talk about 2 or 3 things that you think could change in the system and or legislation to improve how these cases are handled. If you could share your thoughts on that, what would be on your priority list to address these issues?
Well, I guess I can speak up first because we're usually kind of at the beginning of the way this works. Number one is just more training available for law enforcement. There's very, very little that's shared about just even just child sexual abuse or just the child sex on sex, child on child sexual behavior, problematic things, whatever terminology. There's very little information that law enforcement officers have. So if a patrolman responds to a call like this, they usually have no idea where to begin. We've got detectives, but even then you become a detective, you get training once you're there on the job, but it's not a lot of information. And then also just, what other resources are there? Who else can we work with? Because if it's not the CAC, if CPS is screening them out, it's pretty limited on kind of where else we can go for help. So just if there's any way to get more kind of partner resources involved on the front end, whether it is, trying to get some of these more under like a supervision aspect to get CPS involved, or even in years past, we had social workers with CPS that were stationed in our police precincts that would be an immediate resource for us that could respond to calls with us to kind of remove us from some things that are more of a behavior or mental health aspect from the front end and kind of let us step back into the traditional law enforcement role. If need be, we can obviously, we'll still investigate, but to have those more on the front end, just from the law enforcement angle, that's where we could certainly see some improvement, just more education for our officers, and then just a quicker response. Not a lot of these start with an officer responding to a scene. There's a great many that come in through CPS or the hospitals, but there's still a percentage where it's an officer in uniform and they're like, holy cow, what am I dealing with here?
Mm-hmm.
And tagging off of that I wonder if it's asking multidisciplinary teams to take a look as to what is happening in their jurisdiction. All jurisdictions handle these cases differently. all law enforcement departments, especially for those 12 and under, handle these cases differently. You know, if it's an 8-year-old who's acted out on a 4-year-old, there may be some law enforcement jurisdictions that will refer that to a child advocacy center, or they may just say this is something that we don't investigate, and they may not have any referrals to provide the family. So I think it's every jurisdiction taking a look at what their current process is, and then saying, what do we have capacity for? Some CACs may not have the capacity to conduct those types of forensic interviews because it's a lot of kids, especially for those younger ones. You're interviewing the alleged victim and then the kid who may have acted out, and then there may be other siblings that we want to talk to see if something has happened to them, or there may not be treatment providers in the area who have the training we've talked about in order to provide that sort of treatment. So it's figuring out what is our system response, who do we want, especially for those younger cases, to be kind of the agency that takes hold of these cases. Is it really under the purview of law enforcement if it's an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old? Is there a better agency that this could be reported to then handle it, to kind of understand what has happened and refer to appropriate treatment? And it seems like, especially when CPS isn't involved, that's where the disconnect is within the system and the team approach. So I wonder if it's just really an assessment of what is happening, what we would like to happen, what do we need in order for these things to happen.
Yeah, I definitely will say it was basically a decision amongst some of our leadership within my unit RPD to say that we will continue to take those younger cases that we know will not be pursued for prosecution. We don't have a policy that governs it. We don't have a unit manual that governs it. The closest thing I would say is the MDT protocol, where we say we're going to bring 75% plus whatever of those kids, but there's really nothing else that's pushing us that direction. And my worry is, as staffing and other needs kind of hit us, is that something that we're going to say we don't have the resources to deal with this, and they might get a phone call and that's it, or maybe just no additional follow-up.
I would agree with both of those points, or all of those points, that the criminal justice system is sometimes seen as the only option because there's no other place to go that's going to follow this family or facilitate getting the family in front of somebody that can give them resources. And so the more we can navigate away from that, the better off we will then be able to, for those that are appropriate to go through the criminal justice system, handle those appropriately. And be able to start to distinguish those, because right now I remember several phone calls where it's like, well, can we just charge so we can then get a guardian ad litem, so we can then have that guardian ad litem file a chins, and then we can all process the charge. And that's not what obviously is intended.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, if it wasn't for having the CAC, I don't know if I didn't have SCAN, I don't know how we proceed with a lot of those cases. And for jurisdictions that don't have something like that, that's literally a resource so close by, I don't know, kind of what their options are. We were thankful, at least for that in Richmond.
I agree with the points that have been made about it. I think it's important. It would be important to see where everybody is first across the state, and then move from that in terms of developing ways to deal with these cases that don't necessarily involve the criminal justice system when it's appropriate.
Anything else? Obviously laws, maybe a change in the scope of CPS and what CPS can help. CPS may be able to assist in these cases.
I'm going to ask the opinion of the panel around this issue about the Marcus Alert, the new law that just passed the General Assembly, which is supposed to increase support for social work support for law enforcement in responding to cases. Do you all see any potential opportunities to maybe incorporate some of this training and response protocol with that person's role? Have you heard anything about that? Issue?
I really don't know how it's going to be actually implemented, but I also know that we get these cases in so many different ways. A lot of mine were just received via an email from the CPS sending over the referral. I know some of the Marcus Alert things they've been working with our dispatchers about those actual calls for service, but for when they don't come in that way. Yeah, if there's some way to kind of loop them in early on, that might actually be a safer way to get the social work kind of aspect involved with some cases versus responding out on the street where things are a bit more dynamic. So yeah, if there's, like I said, if there's any way to help unload some of the mental health and behavioral health burdens off of law enforcement, I'm definitely all for whatever. If it has to come through the Marcus Alert funding, I would be in support of it in any way.
Do you have anything else from the chat? Otherwise, I was going to ask about effective prevention. If our panelists have we talked about interventions. Betty Wade just reminded us prevention is key. So what kind of prevention work is available? What's out there? Any models that you know of? Some good prevention work.
I'm not aware of any specific models of prevention versus like sexual abuse education programs in school for children or things like that. But in thinking through, I'm wondering if it's just more of a cultural context of when kids are born, right, as part of their pediatrician, right, we're talking to parents about sexual development, we're talking to them about healthy sexual development, about typical behaviors that you're going to see. At what point do those behaviors become problematic, so that parents have education, because they're the ones who are in their homes and they may have the best indication of what's happening. And so if they don't know that this is problematic, or if they don't even know what is typical for a child, how do they then know how to reach out for help, and then where to go to reach out for help? So I wonder if some of it even starts in infancy, in that pediatrician's office, and then working through within the communities about engaging in this conversation with kids and adolescents and their parents.
I'm going to jump in because Kristen is providing some really good comments with the State Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance, and they have a pretty robust prevention program there. And there are actually some evidence-based school-based programs for younger children even. There's a program called Care for Kids, which starts even in preschool, and it's kind of incorporating a lot of those issues that you talked about, Brianna. There's an education component with parents around healthy sexuality development, and so I just wanted to kind of share that information because Kristen's here, provided it.
Yay, Kristen. What else do you have in the chat, Nicole, that we might bring up that we haven't addressed yet?
Well, we actually, I think, again, that group is small enough. I think that if Kristen wanted, if she was comfortable, and she's still here, there she is, if she wanted to share some of the work that the Action Alliance is doing around this. Now, I think it is important to note that, because I'm somewhat familiar with some of their programming, is that most of their programming is focused on the older, like adolescent populations, and not younger children so much. So that kind of is a kind of a caveat, but they certainly have a really robust program. So did you want to share some of the information you posted, Kristen?
Yeah, I can share. I was thinking a little bit about the role that we've played with sexual and domestic violence prevention staff, trying to provide training and technical assistance to folks, because we're getting a lot of questions around talking to young people about sexting, primarily that older youth range, or even college age youth, because a lot of folks are just talking about the need for better norms and boundaries around this. So we've really tried to frame it and instill a healthy sexuality perspective, and to normalize conversations around technology in all of our prevention programming. Because I think that, in my experience, a lot of preventionists come from the perspective of there's in real life and there's technology. And the reality is that for young people today, those things are like this. And so it's really important that we're not separating conversations about boundaries and not talking about technology, checking in with people and asking, hey, is it okay if I post this photo to Instagram? or things like that. Those are just some of the ways that we can normalize consent conversations outside of the context of sexual consent. So that's how we've really tried to talk about it, and to put the focus on the person who is sharing non-consensual intimate imagery, because there is such a culture of blaming or shaming, or if you take this photo, it's going to end up on the internet. And while I do understand that that is sometimes what happens, and it is really difficult to get those images off, focusing back on the perpetrator of that harm is what is really important, and making the norms, changing our societal norms, that it's not okay to share those images without another person's consent. That the problem isn't that the person did this. And again, that is generally having conversations with older people, older young people, because I do think that that conversation feels a lot different when we're talking about a 9-year-old who is exploring. But I think that that just gives a little bit of context for how we've been talking about it. And I'd love to continue having these conversations, because our prevention staff are really struggling across the state and want to have these conversations. And it ranges from saying nothing to only talking about the law without talking about how to actually navigate relationships and boundaries, which is really like what we want people to have.
Get a lot of kids in our forensic interviews who reference like their education programs within the forensic interview. Like, what made you decide to tell? Well, I saw hugs and kisses, or this person came and talked to me. But again, it's then the purview then is on that kid to then speak up and talk about the things and be the one to make that report. And then if their families or the other people around them aren't engaging in those conversations, or their school systems don't have those sorts of prevention, then what are the other preventative things that are in place? So where that's lacking is I think the where we can figure out maybe some other avenues for education.
And there has been a shift around this work at the national and somewhat on the state level, of shifting, really looking at prevention of these issues and putting the onus, taking to your point, taking the onus away from children for protecting themselves, and really placing it more on adults, which is where it should be. And so setting up kind of cultures and institutions and organizations that have some safeguards in place, is a pretty fundamental, easy way to start. But I think shifting that can be a heavy lift. And then also the issue of healthy sexuality, when, you start talking that evidence-based program is very difficult to implement with fidelity, because parents get very, very upset when somebody is teaching their 4-year-olds about the appropriate body part terms for the body parts. Like, that is a controversial thing in our culture, to teach children appropriate terminology about their body parts. So there certainly is, to your point, Brown, like there is this total cultural context that I think is important to keep in mind in all of this work, is that we have kind of layers of challenges when it comes to this topic. So I just wanted to share that, and thank you, Kristen, for jumping in.
And Kristen, if I can ask you a question, how would the folks on this call or others access resources that you might have? Are you training on this, or?
I think the best way is probably to connect with me directly, and my team can share any potential resources. We had some training that we were doing in person around talking to youth about technology, and we actually will be releasing a virtual training module this fall from a person about getting rid of adultism in conversations related to sex ed with young people. But I don't think that we've been providing really consistent training, and a lot of that has to do with the pandemic. So I think that we want to, and we're really interested in having those conversations. We just haven't had a consistent avenue for that, especially in the past year and a half.
And so if folks in Virginia wanted to, could they reach out to local programs as well and make them a partner at the table if they wanted to do these multidisciplinary teaming? around that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's something
You
that
think
we encourage. Oh, I'm sorry to cut you off, Jenny. That's something that we encourage from the context of comprehensive primary prevention strategies, of having that community level where you have community coalitions who are working to change these norms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to ask folks if you could share, maybe send either to me or to Taylor Davis, who everybody got an email from, any resources that you have that you think might be helpful for this topic, so that we can make sure those get out and we can post them. Because there are other types of also prevention programs focused on organizational, like there's Stewards of Children, which SCAN is been using and implementing, you know, a lot, and there's actually a lot of work happening at the state level with that. And that's kind of one of those one and done types of things, with generally there's not a lot of really positive, favorable long-term outcomes, but that's one of the programs that actually is effective for organizational change. So I think it'd be great if folks could share any of those types of resources that you have, so we can make sure that gets out.
So either to you or to Taylor. Yeah. And do you want to talk about next steps, Nicole? Could you do?
Well, I can share with the folks that here that we are working on partnering with the Department of Health to access some funding to hire a consultant, who's Nancy, to help us develop some state and local level guidance, so that we can, with the ultimate goal of having like this tool that we have that we can share with localities. And what's interesting about this topic is the more I talk to different folks in this world of child abuse prevention, everybody is desperate for help on this. So I think that this is a project that's just starting, and I see a lot of potential for helping localities really increase responses to this.
Do you have a sense of timeline, Nicole?
Yeah, so we're hoping, I haven't talked to Nancy about this, but we're
I perked up. I was like, yeah.
So Nancy, no, we're hoping to have something available by the beginning of next year. So yeah, put me on the spot, Jenny.
We might want to say spring,
Spring,
early summer,
after the new year in 2022.
2022. Yeah, let's say that.
That's good. That's a good time frame. That's right. Yeah. Is there anything else that anyone wants to offer? Any comment, question? I think we got a lot of good information today and insight. It's clear that there is a great need out there for services and for response for children and their families in this area. And so we are very hopeful that we can move the needle a little bit on the CAN committee and through the FACT board, and get resources available to communities and folks in Virginia. Appreciate your time and your comments and your participation. Thank you to Judge White, to Ellen, to Adrian, and to Brianna. Thanks so much for your insight and for talking us through these cases.
Thank you.
Are we adjourned? Anything else, Nicole? I don't have anything else.
All right.
Unless anybody wants to send me. I did want to just point this out, that we had a probation officer from Loudoun County, Jason, who had to jump off early, and he had some really good information to share. So I'm going to follow up with him. And I just wanted to let y'all know that.
Okay. All right.
Great.
Thank you all very much. And thank you folks for logging on.
Yeah.
Have a nice
Stay
weekend.
dry. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.
You too.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye. Bye.